The tavern on the fringes of New Proxima was alive with the pulse of a dozen worlds. Laughter in 3 different dialects spilled from a corner table, where a group of Centrans argued over the score of some off-world sport, their elongated fingers clattering mugs against wood. A trio of Martians traded crude songs with a pair of reptilian traders, their harmonies clashing, but somehow managing to keep time with the tavern's old jukebox. It was always like this, raucous, vibrant, unpredictable. And through it all, Dan O'Brien worked the bar with the same steady rhythm he always had, polishing glasses, pouring drinks, and keeping the peace with a word and the weight of his gaze. His forearms flexed as he lifted a barrel tap into place, sleeves rolled to the elbow against the heat of the crowd. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who could handle trouble if it came, but whose presence made most think twice before trying. Behind those blue eyes, though, there was always a hint of distance, a quiet heaviness that came from growing up under the shadow of a father who had fought a war but never spoken of it. Don had learned young that some silences could not be pried. Open only endured. The tavern door swung open with a sigh of hydraulics, and cool evening air pushed through the haze of drink and alien musk. Conversations dimmed for a moment as the newcomer entered. Even in a place where species from across the galaxy mingled freely, she stood out. Her skin was the pale blue of Azuran twilight, lined with the graceful etchings of age. Silver hair was swept neatly back, framing almond eyes that glittered with intelligence and long habit of command. She wore a coat of dark leather trimmed with silver filigree, an outfit both elegant and practical, and every step she took carried the weight of dignity. Dan noticed her immediately. You didn't tend bar on the fringe without learning to spot the powerful ones, the ones whose presence parted rooms without a word. She made her way to the counter, and he set down a fresh coaster in front of her before she had even settled. Onto the stool. What can I get you, ma'am? His voice was calm, even, practiced. Something mild, she replied, her tone melodic, though, touched with the faint tremor of years. Perhaps that tan whiskey I see behind you. Neat, with water on the side? He reached for the bottle without hesitation, his motions efficient. But as he poured, he noticed her gaze wasn't on the glass. It was fixed on his right hand, more specifically on the silver ring that gleamed against the dim light as he tilted the bottle. The band was simple yet unusual, etched with patterns that seemed to shift faintly in the glow, and crowned with a small blue stone. That is an interesting piece of jewelry, she said, and though her words were casual, her voice was taut. As a pulled wire, Dan glanced at the ring, then back at her, puzzled. This old thing? Family heirloom. The woman's breath caught. She leaned forward, urgency breaking through her careful composure. May I see it? Please. Something in her tone made refusal impossible. Slowly, Dan extended his hand across the polished counter. Her cool blue fingers brushed against his skin as she turned the ring under the light. Her breathing quickened, and her eyes shimmered with something raw recognition, grief, disbelief. Where did you get this ring? Dan frowned. It was my father's, passed down to me when he died. Her composure cracked. Your father? What was his name? James O'Brien. He served with the coalition during the Proxima conflict. Her fingers trembled as she released his hand, the untouched whiskey before her forgotten. I knew him, she whispered, voice almost breaking. I knew James O'Brien. This ring? Her gaze locked on the stone, unblinking. I gave it to him, before the war. Dan's chest tightened. The tavern noise seemed to fall away, leaving only the steady thrum of his heart. That's not possible. This ring's been in my family for generations. He told you that to protect you, she said, her words like a knife slipping through the certainty of his memories. It was no heirloom. It was crafted on my homeworld of Azura. I gave it to your father the night we promised to marry when the war ended. Dan felt the room tilt beneath him. His father, who had built a new life on Earth, who had raised him with a human wife, who had never spoken of the war, except in the silence of his nightmares, had loved an alien woman enough to carry her ring across the stars. Everything he thought he knew about his family twisted under the weight of her revelation. The woman's eyes softened, brimming with a sadness that seemed endless. Your father never came back to me. I thought he was dead. But he lived. He lived and raised a son. Her hand brushed her lips, as if holding back decades of grief. And now that son wears the ring I gave him. Dan's breath caught his, throat dry. For the first time in years, he felt like a child again, staring up at a father he never truly understood. Only now, staring into the eyes of the woman across the bar, he realized just how much had been buried in silence. Dan's modest apartment above the tavern was quiet, save for the low hum of the city's hover traffic seeping in through the thin windows. He sat on the edge of his bed long after closing, the silver ring gleaming faintly in the dim light. His father's voice echoed in memory gruff, dismissive whenever Dan had asked about the war. Some things are better left buried, son. It had always ended there, with silence, with distance. But now the silence was cracking. An elderly Azuran diplomat had looked at that ring and seen not an heirloom but a promise. Dan rubbed a hand over his face, sleep refusing to come. Finally, with a muttered curse, he climbed the narrow steps to the attic, a place he had avoided since his father's death. Dust coated the old rafters, thick enough that his boots left dark prints. Cardboard. Boxes lay stacked in crooked towers, some marked with faded military codes, others with his mother's neat handwriting. Dan dragged one forward, pried it open, and began to dig. The first box held medals, bronze and silver, awarded for campaigns whose names meant little to Dan. Underneath, a folded flag, edges worn from handling. He closed the lid gently and set it aside. Another box revealed old photographs, his father in uniform, standing stiffly beside other human soldiers. None of them showed the faint blue woman who had confronted him tonight, dot by the third box. Sweat clung to his temples. He nearly missed the small titanium case, buried beneath layers of yellowed reports. Its surface gleamed even under decades of dust, and on one corner a biometric pad winked faintly, still alive. Dan's pulse quickened. He pressed his thumb to the pad, expecting rejection. Instead, the lock clicked open, a soft hiss escaping as if the case itself sighed at being disturbed. Inside lay a bundle of objects that stilled him where he knelt. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. A stack of thin iridescent sheets that shimmered faintly when they caught the light. 3 data crystals, each humming with dormant memory, and at the very top, a photograph. Dan's hand shook as he lifted it. His father, James O'Brien, younger than Dan had ever known him, stood smiling with his arm around a tall, blue-skinned woman. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, her almond eyes filled with a joy that transcended the frozen moment. Athona. There was no mistaking her. The air seemed to thin. Don sank onto the floorboards, opening the journal with careful fingers. His father's handwriting sprawled across the pages, a voice preserved in ink. The commanders warned us about fraternization, but they never warned us about love. Athona is brilliant, compassionate, fierce. She sees patterns in the stars that no one else can. When she looks at me, I feel more than a soldier. I feel human. Page after page unfolded a story Dan had never been told. Battles fought, nights stolen under alien skies, a secret engagement sealed with the very ring now on his hand. Then the entries darkened. They've discovered our relationship. Someone in her government sees us as a threat. If I stay, Athona will be targeted. The only way to protect her is to disappear, to let her think I died. The ring will be my tether to the life we should have had. The final entry ended abruptly. 3 days before the war's conclusion, Dan closed the journal, his throat thick. His father hadn't abandoned Athona. He had sacrificed everything to shield her. And in doing so, he had left behind a silence that had shaped Dan's entire life. Through the window, dawn was beginning to break, casting the city towers in pale. Gold. Dan stared at the ring, turning it slowly on his finger. His father's legacy was no longer a blank space. It was alive, burning in his hand, pulling him toward truths he had never asked for, but could no longer ignore. When the tavern opened again that evening, Dan knew he would have to face her Athona Nix, the woman who claimed his father's heart. And he would have to decide whether to walk away from the past or step into it fully, no matter what it revealed. The diplomatic quarter of New Proxima gleamed in the dying light, its towers of alloy and glass catching the colors of sunset. Don O'Brien felt out of place walking those immaculate streets. He had put on his best jacket, but it still smelled faintly of oak casks and whiskey. Compared to the silk-robed ambassadors gliding through security checkpoints and courtyards lined with alien flora, he looked every bit the tavern keeper he was. Yet the card in his pocket, embossed with Athona Nix's seal, had been enough to get him past gates and watchful guards. A uniformed Vesperian with 4 arms greeted him at the entrance to a sleek high-rise. "Ambassador Nix is expecting you," the being said in accented coalition standard, bowing with 2 hands while gesturing with the others toward a private elevator. Don nodded stiffly and stepped inside. The doors opened onto a suite that took his breath away. Wide windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the twin moons rising above the sprawl of New Proxima. The furnishings curved in graceful arcs, cushions and couches draped in fabrics of deep blues and silvers. Artwork hung on the walls, living pieces that shimmered and shifted when he moved his eyes. The air smelled faintly of ozone and flowers he couldn't name. Athona stood near the window, framed in silver light. Tonight she wore flowing robes rather than the leather coat, her posture still regal despite her age. She turned, a small smile softening her lined face. "Daniel, thank you for coming." Dan cleared his throat. "I found his things. My father's journal. The photos. You were telling the truth." Athona's eyes glistened with sorrow and relief. "I never doubted you would find proof. He hid them for you as much as for me." She gestured toward a low table set for dinner. "But words alone will not answer all your questions. Sit, eat. There is someone you should meet." A side door slid open, and for a moment Dan forgot how to breathe. The woman who stepped into the room carried the same blue skin as Athona, but her hue was richer, like polished sapphire. Her hair fell in a cascade of silver-blue waves, catching the light of the moons. She was younger, perhaps, close to his own age, with high cheekbones and eyes that gleamed like faceted gems. Her simple dress only accentuated the effortless grace with which she moved. "This is my daughter," Athona said softly. "Leona." Dan rose to his feet automatically. Leona's gaze found his, steady and unflinching. "So," she said, her voice low and musical, "the son of James O'Brien at last." She extended her hand. When their fingers touched, Dan felt a strange current, cool against his skin, yet sparking warmth that traveled up his arm. He held her hand longer than courtesy required, startled by the intensity of her presence. "It's a pleasure," he managed, his voice sounding inadequate in his own ears. "The pleasure is mine," Leona replied, her lips curving in a smile that lit her face. They sat together at the table. The food was unlike anything Dan had tasted delicate. Slices of fruit that glowed faintly, meat seasoned with alien spices, a confection that reminded him of strawberries, kissed with cinnamon. Conversation moved cautiously at first, circling around his father, Athona's memories of the war, and the decades of silence that followed. But it was Leona who drew him in. She spoke with passion about her work as a xenolinguist, decoding lost scripts and connecting forgotten cultures. Her hands moved gracefully as she spoke, and the fire in her eyes revealed her devotion. Dan found himself listening not only to her words, but to the rhythm of her voice, the quiet strength behind it. More than once, he caught her watching him with equal curiosity, as though she too felt the pull of some invisible thread dot as dessert plates were cleared. Athona's voice shifted, heavier. "There is something you must understand, Daniel. The ring you wear is not simply a token of affection. It is older than you realize, older than both our civilizations. Your father knew part of its truth, though not all." Dan glanced down at the silver band, the blue stone glowing faintly in the candlelight. "You mean it's not just jewelry?" Leona leaned forward, her gaze locking on his. "It is a key, a precursor relic. My mother gave it to your father because she loved him, but what neither of them knew at first was that it was forged with a purpose. The Void Walkers have hunted it for centuries." Dan's hand tightened on the ring instinctively. "Void Walkers?" Athona's expression hardened. "A sect obsessed with controlling what does not belong to them. They believe the ring leads to an artifact of immense power, and they are not wrong." The room seemed to close in around him. Dan remembered his father's words in the journal, the warnings, the fear that Athona's life was in danger if he stayed. It hadn't only been politics or prejudice that tore them apart. It had been this. Leona's voice softened, though her eyes still burned with intensity. "The ring has already responded to you. That is why you were drawn into this, and why the Void Walkers will come. They will not stop until it is theirs." Dan looked at the two women, one carrying the grief of decades, the other carrying a fire that stirred something deep within him. The weight of the ring on his hand had never felt heavier. For the first time, he realized his father's silence hadn't been about shame. It had been about protection. And now that legacy had fallen to him, the turning point struck like a quiet bell. His life as a tavern keeper had ended the moment Athona saw the ring. Whatever came next would drag him far beyond the bar, the tavern, and the ordinary life he had built. The night air over New Proxima was cool and sharp, the twin moons casting silver light across the diplomatic quarter. Dan had barely slept after the dinner with Athona and Leona. The weight of the ring felt heavier than ever, not just metal on his hand, but a burden pressing against his chest. He had paced the guest suite Athona had provided, replaying his father's journal entries, Leona's fiery eyes, and Athona's quiet sadness until exhaustion finally forced him down. He was jolted awake, not by dawn, but by alarms. A shrill pulse reverberated through the apartment's walls, followed by the hiss of sealed shutters locking into place. Dan sprang to his feet as Athona burst into the room, her robes askew but her voice steady. "They've found us." Leona appeared behind her, already dressed, a slim satchel slung over her shoulder. Her composure was taut, but her gaze flicked to Dan with something more than fear, an unspoken reassurance, as if she had been expecting this. "Void Walkers?" Dan asked, his throat dry. Athona nodded once. "They're advance teams. More will follow." She crossed to a wall panel and pressed her palm against a seemingly solid surface. Hidden mechanisms groaned, and a narrow passage slid open, revealing a dim stairwell descending into darkness. "Move quickly," she urged. The three of them slipped into the hidden corridor. Dan brought up the rear, glancing back only once to see shadows moving across the shuttered windows, figures too tall, too fluid in their movements to be human. His pulse quickened. He had seen soldiers before, but there was something predatory about these shapes. The stairwell ended in a dust-choked tunnel. Ancient transport rails ran down its length, glinting faintly beneath Athona's glowing light sphere. Their footsteps echoed, quick and nervous. This was built before unification, Athona explained between breaths. An evacuation route for diplomats during the border wars, forgotten by most. Leona ran her hand along the wall, her eyes narrowing. These markings precursor script, the same as the ring. Dan slowed, looking at the faint, curling patterns etched into the stone. They seemed to ripple under the sphere's light, like veins glowing beneath skin. He raised his hand, and the ring answered with a faint pulse of blue light. The markings shimmered in response. Before he could speak, a deep boom reverberated. Behind them, shaking dust from the ceiling. The tunnel trembled. "They've breached the upper levels," Athona said sharply. "We must reach the archive." They hurried on until the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Hover sleds, long disused, rested on ancient rails. Most were broken, corroded by time, but one stood intact, faintly humming as if waiting. "Here," Athona said, her eyes flicking to the ring on Dan's hand. "Try." Dan placed his palm on the sled's worn console. The stone on his ring flared, and the machine hummed to life, lights sparking as its engines powered up. He exhaled sharply. "Guess that worked." But before they could climb aboard, voices slithered out of the tunnel behind them. Ambassador Nix, hand over the ring. 3 figures stepped into the chamber. They were tall and willowy, their translucent skin stretched tight over bones too long for comfort. Their eyes were pools of black, no pupils, no whites, reflecting the light sphere with eerie clarity. They moved like liquid shadows, each step precise, too deliberate. The lead Void Walker extended a hand, his voice echoing like stone cracking underwater. "The ring belongs to the Conclave. Surrender it, human, and your suffering will be brief." Dan's jaw tightened. The ring burned warm against his skin, as if urging him. He stepped in front of Athona and Leona. Not going to happen. The Void Walker tilted his head. Human arrogance. Always believing you can control forces beyond comprehension. "Maybe," Dan said, forcing his voice steady, "but we're good at improvising." He grabbed a rusted pipe from a pile of scrap and hurled it at the overhead light panels. The chamber plunged into darkness, broken only by the soft glow of Athona's sphere and the faint blue light of his ring. "Run!" Athona snapped. They scrambled onto the sled, Dan slamming his hand against the controls. The machine jolted forward, ancient stabilizers whining as it surged down the rails. Behind them, energy blasts cracked the air, striking sparks from the walls. Leona clung to Dan's waist, her breath warm against his ear. "Left at the junction," Athona called. Dan wrenched the controls, the sled screeching as it banked into a narrower tunnel. The air rushed past them, hot and metallic. The ring pulsed with every turn, guiding him as if it knew the path better than he did. Minutes later, the tunnel widened again, revealing a cavernous chamber where the air shimmered with faint blue patterns. At its center stood a structure unlike anything Dan had ever seen, a vast circular dais, carved with symbols identical to those on his ring. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Athona's voice was reverent. "The Stellar Archive. We made it." The sled hissed to a stop. Dan dismounted, staring at the dais as its light seemed to draw him forward. His ring flared in response, heat crawling up his arm. He staggered, clutching his wrist. Leona caught him, steadying him with cool hands. Her gaze locked on his, fierce and unwavering. "You're the key, Dan, just like your father. Don't be afraid." The chamber vibrated, the ring blazing with light that spread into the dais. Star charts unfurled across the walls, shifting and aligning in dizzying constellations. Dan's breath caught as visions swam through his mind world's unknown patterns of energy, the pulse of something ancient and alive. Pain lanced through his skull, sharp and blinding. He cried out, dropping to his knees. It felt like fire clawing through his thoughts, forcing its way into every corner of his mind. Leona knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. "Stay with me. Focus on me." Her voice cut through the chaos like an anchor. Dan clung to it, to the warmth in her eyes, and the pain steadied into something else connection. Knowledge flooding into him, overwhelming but not consuming. When he lifted his head, his eyes glowed faint blue. "I see it," he whispered, voice layered with something not entirely human. "The artifact, it's real, and they'll kill us all to claim it." The turning point had arrived. His father had carried the ring in silence, but now it was awake, alive, and it had chosen Dan. The star dancer burst free of New Proxima's gravity. Well, the city's glittering sprawl, shrinking into a sea of light beneath the curve of the planet. Dan gripped the armrest in the co-pilot's chair as Athona guided the ship into the dark between stars. His father's journal, stuffed into his jacket pocket, felt heavier than steel. Every time he looked down at his hand, the ring pulsed faintly, as though impatient. For 3 days they traveled on silent channels, Leona poring over fragments of precursor script, while Athona kept the vessel's course unpredictable. Dan slept little, haunted by visions of spiraling constellations that weren't quite dreams. When sleep finally came, he woke drenched in sweat, the ring glowing against his chest as if trying to rouse him. On the third night, Athona summoned them to the cockpit. Beyond the viewport stretched the expanse of Azura's system, twin suns, flaring gold and violet in the distance. "We're close," she said, her voice hushed. "Lake Luminara lies just beyond the forest moon. If the coordinates are right, the artifact waits beneath it." Leona's eyes caught the light, sapphire bright. "The rings together should be enough to wake it, my mother's and yours." Dan looked from one woman to the other, his throat tight. "And if it isn't enough, then none of us may leave this place alive," Athona said softly. The descent was silent, heavy with the weight of what was coming. Through the viewport, Dan watched Lake Luminara spread out like a sheet of liquid crystal. 3 moons hung above it, their reflections turning the surface into shifting bands of silver and violet. Even without the artifact, it was the most breathtaking place he had ever seen. They landed on a stony outcropping. Mist clung to the water, cool and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of blossoms from the surrounding silver forests. The ring on Dan's hand flared the moment his boots touched the ground, blue light shooting across the surface of the lake. Leona joined him, her own ring a chain pulled from beneath her mother's robes, glowing in answer. She slipped it from her neck, cradling it in her palm. "They're resonating," she murmured, "like they've been waiting for this moment." Dan swallowed hard. Together then, they stepped into the shallows, cool water lapping at their ankles. When they raised their hands side by side, the twin rings blazed, light spilling across the lake in concentric ripples. The water began to tremble. Bubbles surged upward, and with a roar like a world exhaling, something vast stirred beneath. The artifact rose from the depths. A structure the size of a city block, formed from the same dark reflective alloy as the stellar archive. Water cascaded from its surfaces as it ascended, revealing towers and latticework that pulsed with light. It hung in the air above the lake, not heavy but graceful, as though weight were meaningless to it. Dan felt the connection immediately. The artifact reached into him, its awareness brushing against his thoughts. Images flooded his mind, ruined. Ecosystems healed, deserts turned to forests, poisoned oceans restored to clarity. This was no weapon. It had never been meant for destruction. It was a bridge, a tool of renewal. but the serenity shattered as alarms rang out on the star dancer. Athona's voice crackled through the comm. "We're not alone." Above the lake, shadows fell across the moons. A fleet of ships dropped from hyperspace, angular hulls bristling with weaponry. Void walkers. Their black-eyed silhouettes filled the sky, their weapons already charging. Dan's hand clenched around. Leona's. The artifact's voice, or what passed for it, thrummed through his veins. It did not crave battle, but it would respond to him if he chose. The Void Walker's lead vessel descended, projecting a booming voice over the waters. "The ring is ours. The artifact is ours. Surrender, and your deaths will be swift." Gan looked at Leona. She stared back, fierce and unyielding. "This isn't a weapon," she said, "but it will fight to protect itself through you." The ring burned like a star against his skin. Dan raised his hand toward the fleet, and the artifact answered. Every ship froze. Not shattered, not destroyed. Their weapons turned cold, systems flickering as though rewritten from within. Pilots pounded controls to no effect. The artifact's light expanded, a shimmering wave that washed across the fleet, forcing them into stillness. Leona gasped, tears bright in her eyes. "It's showing them what it really is." On the viewports of every Void Walker ship, images bloomed, worlds healed, rivers flowing again, cities rebuilt. The truth carved itself into their minds, stripping away centuries of dogma. They had sought a weapon, but what they faced was a gift of peace. Dan's knees nearly buckled from the strain. Leona's arm shot around his waist, steadying him. "Easy," she whispered. "You're not alone." The light faded. The fleet drifted, harmless, their weapons dark. The artifact lowered itself back into the lake, a gentle giant returning to rest. Dan collapsed onto the rocky shore, his breathing ragged. Leona knelt beside him, her forehead pressed to his. "You did it." He shook his head weakly. "No, we did it. The rings. The bloodlines. It took both." Athona stood behind them, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Your father would have been proud. He always believed this day would come." Dan looked out over the water, the moons reflected on its surface, the artifact pulsing faintly beneath. The ring no longer felt like a burden. It felt like destiny, and in that moment he understood. The fight was not to wield the artifact as a weapon, but to protect it as a bridge between species, between past and future, between destruction and healing. And now, that fight had only just begun. 6 months later, Lake Luminara shimmered beneath the light of the triple moons, its waters rippling softly against stone terraces carved for the newly raised diplomatic hall. The artifact loomed in the distance, half submerged, its towering lattice glowing with a steady rhythm like the heartbeat of the planet itself. What had once been myth and weapon was now sanctuary and open ground where emissaries of a dozen species came not to conquer, but to speak. Dan O'Brien stood on the balcony, leaning on the rail, watching lanterns drift across the lake. His jacket was ceremonial now, cut in the deep blue and silver of Azuran design, though the boots beneath it were still scuffed from work. He never felt entirely comfortable in these clothes, but he had stopped apologizing for it. He was a tavern keeper, a soldier's son, and whether he wanted it or not, the bearer of a legacy larger than himself. Inside, voices swelled in laughter and song. Delegates from worlds that had once stood in silent hostility now dined. The same tables. Even the Void Walker conclave had sent a delegation faces pale, eyes dark, but no longer filled with hate. Their leader, Prelate Vihar, had stood in that very hall hours ago and pledged to abandon conquest, to seek understanding. It was fragile, untested, but it was real. Thinking of slipping away from your own celebration? Leona's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She emerged onto the balcony in flowing Azuran ceremonial robes that glittered faintly in the moonlight. The sapphire of her skin caught the glow, her silver blue hair pinned with delicate filigree. Around her neck hung a pendant containing a shard of the ring her mother had once worn. A matching piece rested against Dan's chest beneath his tunic. He smiled faintly. Just needed some air. I'm still not used to being the center of attention. She slipped her arm through his, resting her head against his shoulder. You stood before fleets and faced down the void walkers. I think you can handle a few overeager diplomats. Dan chuckled, but his smile faded as he gazed at the artifact. I keep wondering if I did the right thing. Waking it, binding myself to it. What if it all unravels? Leona tilted her head up, her eyes fierce and tender at once. My mother says the artifact never chooses wrongly. It saw in you what your father had, humanity in its truest sense, the will to bridge, not destroy. He let out a slow breath, the weight of those words settling into him. Humanity. A bridge, not a weapon. He remembered the keeper's voice in the archive, resonating in his skull. He remembered his father's journal, the desperate choice to disappear to protect the woman he loved. He had walked in that shadow all his life. Now, for the first time, he felt he had stepped into his own path. From inside came the sound of applause, and then Athona's voice, warm and strong, carrying. Across the hall. Dan glanced back to see her standing with the keeper, who had taken a humanoid form for the ceremony. The old grief that had once bent her shoulders seemed lifted. She spoke now not as someone who had lost, but as someone who had been restored. Dan turned back to Leona. Your mother's happy. She is, Leona agreed softly. She found peace with James's memory and with you. She has what she always dreamed of. A legacy not lost, but living. Dan cupped Leona's face, the moons reflected in her eyes. And you? Any regrets, tying yourself to a stubborn human tavern keeper? Her laugh was low and musical. Former tavern keeper. Current interspecies liaison. Artifact awakener. No regrets. He kissed her gently, the kind of kiss that carried both promise and peace. Behind them, the hall doors opened. A young attendant bowed sharply. Ambassador O'Brien, Ambassador Nix, the delegations are ready for the final accords. Dan exchanged a glance with Leona. Ambassador, that still doesn't sound right. It will, she teased, squeezing his hand. Come on, let's show them what a bridge looks like. They walked back inside together, side by side, the pendant fragments at their throats glowing faintly in unison. As the triple moons climbed higher over Lake Luminara, the hall filled with the hum of new agreements, fragile alliances, and the first breaths of something greater than any single species. Dan knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be betrayals, jealousies, and struggles for power. But as he stood there with Leona at his side, the keeper watching silently, and Athona smiling through her tears, he understood what his father had sacrificed for, and what he himself had chosen. Ring had never been a weapon. It had always been a bridge. And now, at last, that bridge was built.